All right, so you were just listening in there on part of a meeting here, of course, between President Trump and the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi. It was an awfully friendly meeting. They both spent a lot of time complimenting each other. They said they have the same goals and they are going to work together to bring prosperity and progress. They each referred to each other essentially as great leaders, and there was a lot of mutual respect here that you saw displayed between the both of them. Now, it sounds like there's a lot of conversations to be had here moving forward in terms of what trade will look like. The question was asked by a reporter to the president of how do you beat China if you're tough on trade with India? And the president went on to say, I'm not trying to beat anyone, and again reiterated his thought here that they're going to move toward a peaceful and prosperous relationship here between the two countries with some transformational reforms here. They also started the meeting with the president saying that it sounds like India has agreed to purchase a lot of oil and gas. And he went on to say we have more than anyone else. And he said that they've been friends for a long time and they're delighted to see each other again. Notable here from some of our reporters that were in the room is that Elon Musk is in the room. You couldn't see him in that shot, but he was in the corner of the room there. You also just perhaps caught a glimpse there of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, also the Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum in that room as well. So I do want to bring in some of our reporters here to help us break this down. Let's start with correspondent Mary Alice Parks. She is also in D.C. with Elizabeth Schulze in our D.C. bureau as well. We also have ABC News' Shannon Kingston at the State Department and ABC News foreign correspondent Matt Rivers, who's tracking immigration developments for us in Mexico, because this is also a crucial part of this meeting in terms of the Indian migrants that have just been deported from the United States as well, and how that relationship will continue. But Mary Alice, I'm curious of your thoughts here, because again, we don't have a lot of the details hammered out here, but it was an interesting way to start here the meeting from the president to say, you know, they're going to be purchasing oil and gas here, just set it as a fact, and then sort of went into this very friendly compliment fest.
Yeah, he said, we are friends and we will remain friends. But of course, we know that they have all these tough topics to tackle, like you said, tariffs, trade at the center of all of that. We've heard the president just today talk about how he is not pleased that the United States still has this trade deficit with India, a big trade deficit with India. He's not pleased with the fact that India has put in place steeper tariffs on U.S. goods coming into India than the United States has on Indian goods coming into the United States. You mentioned immigration, another tough topic, but it was interesting, that moment where he talked about oil and gas. Of course, we know this president wants to expand oil and gas development in the United States where he can. I'm not sure many Americans imagine that he would also be encouraging oil and gas producers to export even more of that to the biggest buyer, to whoever would buy and sort of expand U.S. markets abroad for oil and gas. But that does seem to be President Trump's priority. And of course, I am still thinking so much about that moment earlier in the day when we saw Elon Musk also having his own meeting with Prime Minister Modi. I think so many questions for this administration and this White House going forward about Musk's role in U.S. foreign policy, as well as what will come out of that meeting and what came out of that meeting, as well as what will obviously come out of this meeting with President Trump. Kana.
Right. I know there was an early interest mentioned about Starlink, perhaps in India, some things like that. But Elizabeth, in terms of this trade deficit here and what we might be looking at in terms of what they finally come to an agreement here with, I think, what did he say? We have big trade deals to announce in the future, Elizabeth.
Right, and we're talking about a $45 billion trade deficit with India. And what these reciprocal tariffs that President Trump announced the government will start looking into today is essentially what that would mean is that for a country like India, it could be pretty heavily impacted. Right now, India's average effective tariff rate is about 11%. In the U.S., it's 1.5%. So a reciprocal tariff, Kana, would mean the U.S. raises that up to the same rate as India, around 11%. And essentially what that would mean is businesses that are bringing stuff over from there would end up paying a lot more. And I think it is really notable that we did hear President Trump acknowledge today, Kana, that there could be some short-term pain for American consumers because of these tariffs. But he says ultimately in the long run, he thinks prices will go down because domestic manufacturing will increase. producers will be more incentivized to build stuff in the U.S. than in other countries. But that acknowledgement that consumer prices, the prices we all pay for day-to-day goods, could go up in the short term, especially at a time when prices are already going in the wrong direction when you look at the picture of inflation across the U.S.
Right, and how does he sort of quell the concerns from business owners and consumers in the meantime there as he tries to keep his promise to the American people? But also, Shannon, you know, we knew that China would loom large over this meeting, and a reporter again did bring up the question here. And essentially she brought up the idea of how do you beat China if you're going to be tough on trade with India? What does that relationship say for the wider region? And that's just the trade part of it, right? We didn't hear anything about any sort of defense framework or military cooperation.
That's right. And you heard President Trump say that, he's not trying to beat anyone. He says he's going to work with India, with China, with anyone. But that's really something that's injected a lot of uncertainty into this relationship. But Kana, you did mention the compliments here, because even though these two leaders were using translators, they very much speak the same language. You saw Modi really talking up Trump, talking about Make America Great Again, reminding him of the warm memories they've shared, the huge rallies they've thrown. So he's going to be using that relationship, or looking to use it, to really advance India, because sometimes, when we get meetings like this, the problems arise from leaders being very different. Here, the challenges are going to come from the fact that President Trump and Prime Minister Modi are maybe too similar. They're both populists who are going to be under a lot of pressure to claw out wins from this meeting. And even though Modi has made some kind of symbolic, deferences to Trump leading up to this, the compliments, he can't be seen as having capitulated on everything when he gets home.
Yeah, certainly. No question about that. He has his own people to answer to. And what he said? He said this is the oldest democracy meeting with the largest democracy. And in his mind, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2 in this scenario. 1 + 1 equals 11 for these two countries to come together and meet. But that also, Matt, we cannot overlook here the immigration issue. Of course, we know that President Trump campaigned on an immigration crackdown, and he is certainly following through on that. And that is impacting India. In fact, I think you told me, right, the number of 725,000 unauthorized migrants from India were living in the United States, but you think perhaps the number is even really higher than that now.
Yeah, because that number from the Pew Center, which is absolutely should be believed, was from 2022. And what we know is that since 2022, Kana, the amount of Indians that have been detained, and many of whom were ultimately released by Border Patrol, numbers well over 100,000. So there's even more people there now. And we saw a deportation flight flown from the United States back to the northern part of India just recently. So India joining the list of many other countries like Mexico and Colombia in all of this immigration crackdown. And I think what you're going to hear, or at least one of the unspoken goals, rather, from the Prime Minister of India would be to make sure that India doesn't fall into the same boat as, like, let's say, Colombia, which had to go through being threatened with punishment from the United States in order to control migrant flows, given the number of Indians that we have seen consistently show up at both the southern and the northern border to the United States, that you can bet that's going to be a topic. And India, certainly, with all of these other issues that my colleagues have mentioned between the United States and India, Indian leadership certainly does not want migration to stand in the way of so many other issues that these two countries have to face.
Yeah, absolutely not. And Mary Alice Parks, I also don't want to overlook this question that was asked about USAID, because you had brought up earlier India is a huge recipient of it. And the question that was asked was to the president. Do you think that they interfered, USAID, do you think they interfered with the 2020 election in the United States, or perhaps the 2024 election elsewhere? And as the president started to talk about that, Mary Alice, he then sort of dove into what he would like to change in terms of United States elections. He wants one-day voting, voter ID, paper ballots. We have heard this Republican talking point before, but they seem to kind of be moving away from some of those ideas.
Yeah, largely because Republican governors don't want the federal government dictating how elections are run state by state. I mean, it's been a longstanding tradition in this country that states get to administer their own elections. That's a part of how elections are kept safe and secure, how ballot counting is kept safe and secure. So it's going to be really interesting if Trump and if Republican colleagues on Capitol Hill try to push a new version of a voting and elections law, ahead, as they've talked about. And very very interesting that he punted on this question of foreign aid. No doubt he is taking a negotiating tool off the table after having totally froze foreign aid across the globe. This was a way that past presidents had been able to negotiate and leverage soft power with other partners and allies around the globe, especially developing countries. And so no doubt that's going to be a big part of his conversation with Prime Minister Modi today as well.
And certainly, just lastly, before we go, we know that Ukraine came up as well. And we heard from the prime minister who said that he spoke with both President Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. And he said that people think India doesn't have a side in all of this. No, we have a side, and our side is peace.